The cold hit me hard the moment I stepped off the train in Milltown, Pennsylvania. It wasn't just winter, it was the kind of still, heavy cold that seeps into the cracks of buildings and bones, the kind that makes you feel like time stopped somewhere between the war and what came after. My boots crunched over snow that had long since turned to ash-colored ice. I hadn't seen this town in nearly 3 years, but I never stopped seeing her. In the breast pocket of my army jacket, wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked beside a creased photograph, I carried a ring. I'd held onto it since the day I left for Europe. Through every bullet, every foxhole, every muddy trench and sleepless night, I clung to that little gold band like it was a lifeline, like it was the only part of me not marked by death and smoke and the smell of blood. It was for her. Always for her. Before I boarded that troop train in '43, she stood with her hands inside her coat sleeves, trying not to cry. We were just kids, really. 20 and scared. She whispered, "If you come back, I'll be right here." I took her face in both hands and nodded. I believed her. God help me, I believed her. So when I walked down her street again in January of '46, my heart pounding beneath the wool of my uniform, I wasn't ready for what I saw. A man, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, maybe a little older than me, unlocked her front gate with a key that wasn't mine. He smiled and kissed her forehead. She smiled back. It was a gentle smile, the kind that doesn't belong to someone who's waiting anymore. I didn't move. I just stood there with the ring clenched tight in my gloved hand, the cold biting through the leather like punishment. I wasn't angry, not exactly, just hollow, like the world I'd imagined waiting for me had been bulldozed while I was away and no one thought to tell me. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The shutters had been repainted. The swing on the porch had new cushions, and in that small domestic detail, I died all over again. There are some things they don't prepare you for when you come home. They don't tell you what it feels like to survive hell, only to find out that time didn't wait for you, that the promises you kept through fire and fear and freezing nights might not be waiting on the other side. That love, real love, can belong to a different life now. I should have turned around, walked away, but something in me needed to know. Had she forgotten me? Had she mourned me? Did she ever wear the ring I gave her, even for a little while? If this story already has you feeling something, if it stirs even the faintest ache, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that stay with you long after the last word. And now, hold on tight, because what comes next changes everything. Milltown was still Milltown, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was the same grid of narrow streets and telephone poles, leaning slightly like old men, holding their breath. The same white church steeple rising like a promise at the end of Main Street. But something in the rhythm of the place had changed. Or maybe I had. Maybe you leave for long enough and nothing ever quite fits again, even if the sidewalks are still cracked in the same places. I walked past Murphy's Hardware, where we used to pick up paintbrushes for her father's porch projects, but the windows were boarded up and someone had scrawled a crude message in black paint across the door, "Closed for good." A rusted tricycle sat abandoned near the curb, half buried in the snow. I passed children playing quietly in a yard I didn't recognize, faces I didn't know, laughter I couldn't quite join. The world had gone on without me, reshaped itself into something that didn't include my name. There was a small war memorial in the town square now, bronze, polished, too new, names carved with reverence and finality. I ran my fingers along the letters, not looking for mine, but half expecting to find it there, like the town had already buried me. A man in a tan coat nodded at me in passing. I nodded back. But we didn't know each other. I wasn't sure I knew anyone anymore. The diner where her father used to pour coffee and joke with the locals still stood, but the lights inside were dim and the stools at the counter were empty. I pressed my hand against the glass for a moment. Inside, a woman in an apron glanced at me with curiosity and a flicker of recognition, but it passed. Maybe she thought I was a ghost. Maybe I was. I made my way to her mother's house, though it took longer than it should have. I circled the block twice before I had the nerve to climb the steps and knock. The door looked the same, oak with a crack that ran like a lightning bolt across one panel, a brass doorknob polished by years of anxious hands. When she opened it, she froze. Her hair had gone grey at the edges, and there were lines around her mouth I didn't remember, but her eyes knew me. She reached up and covered her mouth like she was holding back a gasp. "We thought you were—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I stepped inside. The living room smelled of cinnamon and furniture polish. The same grandfather clock ticked in the corner, though the chime was slower now. There was a photo of her daughter on the mantel, older, smiling, wearing a coat I'd never seen, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. "She waited," her mother said, voice shaking. "She waited for over a year. She stood by that window every day, but she had to go on living." She swallowed hard. "He's a doctor, came back from France in '45, works over at the VA now." "She married him?" I asked, though I already knew. 6 months ago." I nodded. That was all. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. What was there to ask? I thanked her quietly and left, walking the old streets with a new weight pressing against my ribs. My boots scuffed the edge of the sidewalk where we used to stop for lemon ice in July. The stand was gone, of course. Everything was gone, or changed, or both. I walked past the park where we carved our initials into a tree near the swings. The tree was still there, but the bark had grown over our mark like skin healing over a scar. Time had covered what we did here. Time had no use for old promises. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. I couldn't even resent him, the man who'd taken my place. What kind of man would I be if I blamed her for surviving? I was the one who left. She stayed. She endured the silence, the telegrams that never came, the slow erosion of hope. And then, when all of that was done, she found a way to begin again. It was me who came back expecting the past to hold still. It was me who thought that war would press pause on life. But Milltown had moved forward. The streets had filled with strangers. The benches had been repainted. And she had found warmth where there had only been winter. That night, I stood by the bridge where we once talked about the future. The water below looked the same, but the current had shifted. I held the ring in my hand again. Its weight hadn't changed, only everything else had. And in that moment I knew I was no longer walking through my hometown. I was walking through a memory that no longer belonged to me. There's a certain kind of silence at the front that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not the absence of noise, far from it. It's the silence between things, between explosions, between commands, between the crackle of gunfire and the next breath you're not sure you'll take. And in that space, in that narrow space between life and death, I kept a promise. The ring never left my chest pocket. Through Belgium, across the frozen edges of Germany, all the way to a battered farmhouse outside of Bastogne, it stayed with me. Some guys carried Bibles, others wore St. Christopher medals or photos of pin-up girls. I carried her ring. I'd had it engraved just before I shipped out. My name etched on the inside in a shaky script. I scratched myself with a pocket knife, hunched over a bunk with a flashlight at 2 in the morning. Her name was already on the outside, like she belonged to me even then, like I belonged to her, no matter where the war scattered me. We didn't have much time before I left, just one long weekend, but we made the most of it. In a quiet moment on the back porch of her house, beneath the rustling of dry October leaves, we exchanged rings. Not a proposal, not yet, but a promise. I slipped hers onto her hand. She held mine tight in her palm. "If you come back," she said, "I'll still be waiting." I carried those words like ammunition. The winter of '44 was cruel. The ground froze hard, then turned to a sucking mud that took your boots and your will to fight if you let it. We dug trenches with bleeding hands, shared soggy cigarettes, and wrote letters we didn't know would ever be read. And through it all, I would touch the ring through my jacket, press it into my palm until it hurt. That pain reminded me I was alive and that I had something worth coming home for. I remember one night, quiet, too quiet, when I finally took the ring out and held it under the light of a candle stub. It gleamed like a lie in the darkness. Beautiful, clean, untouched by everything around me. I remember whispering her name into the cold and promising her, even though she couldn't hear, that I'd make it back, that I'd put it on her finger for real this time. Then came the letter. December 1943. Delivered in the middle of nowhere, wrinkled, stained by someone else's fingers before it reached mine. She wrote, "Don't forget me, even if the world forgets us." That sentence undid me. I read it so many times the ink began to fade. I slept with it folded under my shirt, pressed over my heart. It wasn't just love, it was survival. I wrote her letters I never sent. One in particular I remember, written in the mud outside Aachen. My hands were shaking too much to write straight, and the paper kept getting wet, but I poured everything into it. I told her about the stars above enemy territory, how they looked just like home, how every gunshot reminded me of firecrackers on the 4th of July. I told her I still remembered the way she smelled after the rain. I ended it with, "Wait for me if you can." But I never mailed it. It felt like too much to ask. There was one night I thought I lost the ring. We'd been pushed back fast. Bombardment hit hard, and I must have dropped it crawling through the muck. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I dug through sludge and torn canvas, even waded into a frozen ditch. I found it hours later, stuck under a broken helmet half buried in blood and straw. I wept when I held it again, not because I was sentimental, but because without it, I didn't know who I was anymore. We never talked about marriage before I left, not seriously. But in the trench, I planned the proposal 1,000 times over. I'd kneel under the old oak tree near the reservoir, give her the ring again, this time with the war behind us. I imagined her laughing through tears, saying yes, her mother watching through the window with a hand pressed to her chest. That's what I fought for. Not medals, not flags. Her. I never spoke about her to the other guys. I couldn't. She was too sacred, too private to share in a world where nothing else was safe. But every time someone around me didn't make it, I'd whisper a thank you under my breath, not for their death, but for my borrowed time. Some nights, I still dream of those foxholes, the smoke curling through the trees, the cold that numbed your bones so deeply you forgot you had fingers. And in every dream, I reach into my pocket and find that ring, smooth, familiar, eternal. Like a piece of home I never really got back. I believed, right up until I walked back into Milltown, that I'd hand her that ring again. I never considered that I'd be the only one who kept the promise. I spent 2 days walking past her street without stopping. Once in the morning, once at dusk. I told myself I was just passing through, just stretching my legs, just taking in the cold Pennsylvania air. But each time, I slowed down at the corner, let my eyes drift to her porch, half hoping, half dreading she'd step out and see me there. Hollowed out, older, changed, a ghost wearing the skin of the boy she once knew. There was a part of me that wanted to turn around and leave town without ever speaking to her. Let her live her life, untouched by the confusion I now carried like an extra weight in my coat. I'd seen too much to believe in neat endings. I didn't expect anything from her. I didn't want to ruin what she'd managed to rebuild. But the ring, God, the ring still pressed against my chest like a question I couldn't silence. She deserved to know I came back, that I kept my promise, even if I arrived too late for it to matter. So on the third morning, I stood in front of her house just as the frost began to melt off the window panes. My breath rose like smoke, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I rang the bell. The door opened slowly, almost cautiously. She stepped out, and for a moment neither of us moved. She didn't scream. She didn't smile. She just looked at me. "You're alive," she whispered. I nodded. I am. Whole, more or less. Just not sure what for. We didn't speak for a long time after that. She invited me to walk, and we ended up in the park where we used to sit on Saturday afternoons. Only now the benches were worn and splintered, and the trees had grown into themselves. We sat without touching. Her coat brushed mine, but we didn't acknowledge the closeness. I waited, she said after a while, her voice soft. A year almost. I wrote letters I never sent. I asked about you at the post office every week. She looked down at her gloves. Then one day I stopped asking. You did what you had to, I replied. I would have told you to do the same. She turned to me. You were gone. There were days I thought maybe you weren't coming back at all. And then he helped. He listened when I couldn't speak. He understood the silence. I swallowed. The ring was in my pocket. My fingers found it without thinking, turning the band slowly, rhythmically, as if it might keep me grounded. I didn't come to ask for anything, I said, not to change anything. I just needed you to know that I came back, that I meant it. She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes, but no breakdown, no drama. Just that quiet ache you can only find between two people who once dreamed of a future that never came. I thought you'd be angry, she said. I was, I admitted. But not at you. At time. At war. At the universe for taking so long. We sat there until the light began to fade, the shadows stretching across the grass like a curtain drawing down over an old play. She reached into her bag, pulled out a photograph, us, from the summer before I left. She'd kept it all this time. You were my world, she said. I just couldn't live in memory forever. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who had survived in a different way than I had. She hadn't faced bullets or freezing nights in France, but she had buried hope piece by piece until something else could grow in its place. I'm glad you found someone who could hold your grief, I said quietly. I hope he knows how lucky he is. She smiled through her tears. And I hope you find someone too. I didn't tell her that I didn't want anyone else, that my heart still beat to the sound of her laughter, that every night I laid awake overseas, I imagined her face, her hands, the way she looked at me when I told her I loved her the first time. Some truths are too heavy to hand over. When we parted, I didn't kiss her. I didn't even touch her hand. We simply stood and looked at each other, like we were saying goodbye to a chapter we both still wanted to reread, but knew we never would. I turned to leave. Wait, she said. I stopped. I'm glad you came back, she whispered. I nodded once, the ring still tight in my fist. I didn't answer. Some words didn't need to be returned. Some just needed to be received. That night, I didn't sleep. The wind outside scraped against the windows like it was trying to speak some forgotten truth, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps that weren't mine. The ring sat on the desk beside me, glinting under the low lamp, next to the wooden box I had carved by hand in a mess tent outside Metz. Birchwood, sanded smooth with whatever scraps I could find. I'd etched my name on the underside of the lid with the edge of a mess knife. It was rough, uneven, but it was mine. I'd meant to give it to her the moment I got back. I imagined presenting it to her with trembling hands and tearful eyes, watching her open it and cry and throw her arms around me. I imagined us laughing through the grief, finally allowed to be whole again. But that was a version of our story that would never be written. Now it was just a box, a memory made physical, a gesture that no one would witness but me. I woke before sunrise and dressed in silence. I placed the ring inside the box, folded the lid closed, and tied it gently with twine. It felt light and heavy all at once, like hope, like goodbye. The streets were quiet as I walked. Milltown was still asleep, houses dark, chimneys cold. I turned the final corner, her porch coming into view with the same familiarity it always had. I didn't hesitate. I didn't let myself think. I climbed the steps, knelt briefly, and placed the box carefully on the top step, scented, clean, a soldier's offering. No note, no explanation, just wood and gold and silence. I didn't knock. I didn't linger. I walked away without turning back. Maybe she'd find it before breakfast. Maybe it would sit in the cold for hours. Maybe someone else would pick it up and never know what it meant. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was no longer mine to hold. I boarded a train that afternoon bound for Chicago. I didn't choose the city for any particular reason. It was far enough from Milltown to make forgetting possible, but familiar enough to feel like America. Steel, smoke, noise, the kind of place where no one asked where you'd been or who you lost. I found work with the railroads. Nothing glamorous, just labor, boxes, ledgers, track checks. I took room in a boarding house near the yard where walls were thin and voices were tired. No one spoke much. We were all men who'd returned with stories we didn't tell. At night, in my small room with the single window that faced the tracks, I'd sit on the edge of the bed and close my hand around nothing, just the empty space where the ring used to rest. Muscle memory, maybe. Or something deeper, a need to keep holding on, even when there was nothing left to hold. I never reached out to her again. Never wrote. Never asked if she received the box or opened it or cried. I didn't need to. In my version of the story, the one I keep to myself, she found it. She opened it. She remembered. And maybe, just maybe, she smiled through tears, whispered my name, and placed it somewhere safe. I stayed in Chicago. I lived, I ate, I worked, I laughed sometimes. But I didn't marry. I met women, sure. Some who made me feel seen. A few who maybe would have stayed if I'd let them, but I never carved another name into wood, never bought another ring, because that promise, made in a Pennsylvania backyard and carried through the fire and mud of Europe, was never meant to be replaced. It wasn't about her anymore, or me. It was about honoring what we had, about letting go without erasing, about loving someone so fully that even silence became a kind of devotion. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I imagine walking back to that porch years later, asking her if she still had the box. But I don't go. Some stories deserve to end in mystery. And in the end, she gave me exactly what I needed, a reason to survive, a reason to come home, even if home wasn't what I thought it would be. Looking back now, all these years later, I realized that surviving the war was the easy part. What came after, learning how to live with the silence it left behind, was the real battle. The kind that doesn't end with peace treaties or parades. The kind you fight quietly inside yourself, long after the uniforms have been packed away and the guns have gone cold. I never married. There were moments when I almost did. A woman I met at a church picnic who liked to dance. A nurse who reminded me what warmth felt like. A widow with a son who held my hand when I couldn't sleep. But I never carved another name into anything, never bought another ring. Because that piece of my life, what we had, what we never got to finish, was never meant to be rewritten. And maybe that's okay. Some promises aren't meant to be fulfilled. Some are meant to carry us through the fire, to give us something to hold on to when everything else is falling apart. That ring, that box, that memory of her whispering, "If you come back," they were never about the ending. They were about survival, about belief, about hope made solid enough to fit in a pocket and press against your heart. I've had a good life, a quiet one. I worked, I ate, I slept, I laughed when I could. I helped build tracks that took other people to places they'd never forget. And every now and then, when the wind hit just right, I thought of her. Wondered if she ever found the box, if she ever told her children or grandchildren about the boy who once swore he'd come home just for her. But I never needed to know for sure, because in my version of the story, the only version that still matters, she did. And that's enough. I still keep a drawer full of old photographs, black and whites from the war, some letters I never mailed, and one picture of her, smiling, eyes half closed against the sun. I don't look at it often, but when I do, I remember who I was, who we were, who we might have been. And somehow, that makes the silence bearable. There's no statue of me, no medal hanging in a museum, but I left something behind, a promise buried in wood and gold, a truth no one else saw. And in the end, maybe that's what love really is. Not what lasts forever, but what carries you through the parts of life you thought you'd never survive. She saved me. Without ever knowing it, we post new videos every day, real stories that move and inspire.